I want to start with a demonstration of the history of energy through the lens of lighting. The very first lighting that humans had, of course, was fire. And we gained widespread control of fire about 125,000 years ago. At first gathered from the environment, and eventually we were making fire, at first with friction. And a little bit more efficient for lighting, we started using oil from plants or from animal fat. And if you melt animal fat or use liquid plant oil and dip a cloth wick in it, you can light that wick, and it is a cleaner burning, better light source than just an open fire. And it's a little bit sloppy to have liquid fuel sloshing around. After a while, 1,500 years later, we started using candles, using solid fuels, again with a cloth wick to burn. And the wax, or in some cases animal fat, was the fuel that made the light. There was a period in which whale oil, actually rendered fat from whales, was the primary light source, but that was relatively brief. And in the 1840s, petroleum lamps were the primary light source, in public and at home. And the era of petroleum lamps was actually relatively short-lived, just from the 1840s until the 1870s in public places, and then in the early 1900s and in homes, and in 1870s in public, and in the early 1900s in homes, we began using electric lights, which is where we are now. Energy is complicated, as you can see here. This is just a little bit more complicated version of the graph that you already saw from your readings, but I think it exemplifies to me pretty well how many just how many layers there are to our energy system, how many sources, how many destinations, how many losses. It's a complicated system. I think John did a really good job of examining some of the downfalls of coal. He was looking at mountaintop removal mining in the Appalachian Mountains out east. The bulk of the coal these days in our country is actually coming from Montana and Wyoming. Not from underneath mountains, but from underneath plains in the Powder River Basin. Very similar situation. There is a layer of what the mining industry calls overburden, which is just earth that gets stripped away, and then the coal gets removed. Some of the biggest, something that I liked, but some of the biggest trucks, some of the biggest machines in the world are at work right now, chewing up layers of coal in the Powder River Basin and putting it on trains, sending it around the country to power plants. And we could tell similar stories about the problems associated with oil, pipelines, oil spills, oil drilling, all sorts of problems there. Could tell similar stories about natural gas, fracking, the pollution that causes, the earthquakes, the social problems. We could tell stories about nuclear power and the waste that's generated and the problems with mining uranium. Gosh, there's some really horrifying stories about uranium mining. Could tell stories about solar and wind and the resources those require to produce the equipment that generates those powers, those electrons. There's no silver bullet for our energy needs. There's no single solution that's going to make everything okay. And that's tough for our minds, because I think we naturally want a single solution that makes everything better. It's going to be a lot of different pieces to the puzzle, and a piece that doesn't get talked about often enough, I think, one of my favorite pieces is, I sometimes think the simplest solution is often the best. And the simplest solution to me is just use less power. The story that I like the best about that is actually about Austin, Texas. In the early 80s, Austin was growing and demand for power was growing. And the utility there that generates electricity is run by the city. Um, the city told the utility that instead of building a new power plant, it should focus its efforts on efficiency and just using less power. So the utility instituted programs uh, throughout the city to help people use less power. So there was money made available and programs made available to help people update their heating and cooling systems to make them more efficient, to insulate their homes and businesses better, paint the roofs white of buildings to reflect sunlight in the summer to reduce demand for air conditioning. Um, and this program is ongoing, so now it includes replacing outdated light bulbs with LEDs, and more and more money gets poured into saving electricity in Austin. And it is expensive, but it's far cheaper than building power plants. And this is something my neighbor is a green builder, and he gets mad about solar panels because he thinks that you can always save more electricity by insulation than you can generate electricity with solar panels. That was an interesting thing for me to hear from him because I'm a big fan of solar panels, but there's other ways to think about electricity than just generating more of it. This is the last video like this that I am producing. Um, so holy moly, quarter's basically over. This has been a wild one. Never expected to be doing anything like this. So thank you for bearing with me. I really appreciate it. I know you've all put a lot of work into this course. Well, most of you, looking at the numbers, but yeah, good work. Thanks. Bye.